The forest was alive with whispers, though no one spoke. Moonlight filtered through dense, skeletal branches, casting a silver glow that trembled across the undergrowth. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, made the hearts of the women tighten in their chests. Midnight in occupied France was no friend to the faint-hearted, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible, inevitable to unfold, clad in dark. Worn jackets and boots that had seen better days. A small group of women pressed forward, moving like shadows themselves. At their head was Elise, barely 22, but her eyes held a steel the Nazis had yet to comprehend. Behind her, Marguerite adjusted the strap of a satchel filled with what little explosives they had managed to procure. Jean, the oldest at 27, her face lined with worry and courage alike, kept scanning the tree line, listening for the distant echo of boots on dirt roads or the hiss of enemy whispers carried by the wind. Quiet, Lisa breathed, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind. She crouched low, planting her hands on the cold, damp earth. They're near. Keep close, keep steady. The forest seemed to pulse with tension. Somewhere beyond the trees, Nazi patrols prowled in calculated, ruthless rhythms. Soldiers with rifles slung and lanterns bobbing moved through the village roads, unaware that tonight the hunted were about to become the hunters. Civilians slept in uneasy beds, trusting blindly that the war would spare them for another night. But these women had no such luxury. The village, their families, even their own fragile lives, everything depended on what they did before dawn. Marguerite pressed forward, letting the weight of the satchel settle against her hip. "We can't afford a mistake," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Her fingers trembled slightly as she checked the crude detonator one last time. The sound of it, a soft, metallic click, made her pulse leap. Elise nodded. "One wrong move, one careless sound? It's over. But if we succeed, we hit them where it hurts most." Her gaze swept over her companions, seeing the same fire reflected in their eyes. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it something fiercer, resolve. They were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, ordinary women driven into extraordinary defiance. A sudden rustle to their right froze them all. Jean's hand shot up, signaling a halt. The branches quivered as if the forest itself was trembling, and a fox darted across their path, disappearing into the shadows. A nervous laugh escaped Marguerite's lips, quickly stifled by the gravity of their mission. Every heartbeat felt deafening in the quiet night. A drumbeat of imminent danger. They reached a clearing, the kind that left them exposed, yet offered the only path to the dirt road the convoy would take. Elise knelt in the soft grass, tracing the path with her eyes. "They'll be here in 30 minutes. Maybe less," she whispered. "We need to be ready." The wind carried faint voices from the village below. German commands barked harshly, the sound distant yet distinct enough to make their stomachs knot. Somewhere, a dog barked, a lone sentinel warning of the night's tension. Each sound reminded them that time was both an enemy and an ally. Jean exhaled slowly. "Do you think they suspect us?" she asked, voice tight. Elise shook her head, her dark hair brushing against her face. "No, they never suspect women. That's our advantage. They underestimate us. That's what will save this village, if we don't falter." The women moved into position, instinctively forming a semicircle around the narrow road. Shadows fell across their faces, obscuring the fear and determination that danced in their eyes. The weight of what was to come pressed upon them, but they did not flinch. Each knew the cost of failure, capture, torture, perhaps death. Yet in that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with them, carrying their courage like a silent prayer. A distant lantern bobbed along the road. The Nazi convoy was coming. Their engines hummed low in the distance, the sound swelling in the silence of the night. The women's hands tightened around their weapons, their breaths shallow but steady. Tonight, the hunted would become the hunters. Tonight, they would strike in the shadows. Elise's whisper cut through the tension, sharp as a blade. "Remember, no hesitation. One move, one mistake, and we're gone. But we succeed, and we remind them they are not invincible." For our families? For our village? For France. The forest held its breath. The night waited, and the women waited, hearts pounding, for the moment that would change everything. The dawn had not yet broken, but the forest was already stirring with quiet life. Birds hesitated in their branches as though aware that this night these women carried a weight far heavier than their wings could measure. The convoy had passed, leaving only the echo of its engines fading into the distance. Yet the danger was far from over. Every patrol, every pair of German eyes, could still find them. Elise crouched behind a thick oak, sketching the path the Nazis had taken in the dirt. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "We know their schedule now," she whispered. 2 convoys per night. Patrols on foot every 30 minutes. They're careful, but predictable. Jean leaned in, squinting at the crude map. "And the villagers?" she asked softly. "They won't forget the road to the mill, will they?" Marguerite shook her head, eyes dark with worry. "They'll hide. Some of them trust us, but not all. If one of them talks?" Her voice trailed, leaving the threat hanging between the trees. In this war, betrayal was a blade sharper than any rifle. Elise's gaze shifted to Marguerite. She knew why her friend's hands trembled. Marguerite had a younger brother, Henry, still hiding somewhere in the village. "I know," Elise said quietly. "You're afraid for him? We all are. But that's why we fight." Marguerite swallowed hard. I can't lose him." "You won't?" Elise assured, her tone firm, carrying both command and comfort. "Not if we succeed tonight. We need to trust each other. That's all we have." The women moved carefully along a hidden path toward a ruined barn at the edge of the forest, a place they had claimed as their temporary headquarters. Inside, dust motes floated through the shafts of early moonlight, and crates of old supplies served as makeshift tables. A lantern flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows against the wooden walls. Maps were spread across the floor, marked with lines and symbols only the women could decipher. Jean traced a line with her finger. "If we strike here," she said, pointing to a narrow bend in the road, "we can trap the convoy between the trees. But we'll need explosives, and we have barely enough." Marguerite bit her lip. "And the guns. One of those patrols saw me the other night. They know someone is watching. If they suspect us—" Her voice faltered. Fear glimmered in her eyes like a flame about to be snuffed out. Elise placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then we don't give them a reason to suspect. Precision, timing, silence. That's how we win. That's how we survive." A sudden knock at the barn door made them freeze. Every nerve screamed danger. Lisa motioned for silence, creeping toward the entrance. Through the gap, a villager, old Monsieur Duval, who ran the bakery, appeared, his face pale and lined. "You're planning something," he said, his voice barely audible. "I saw the men moving last night. They'll be here sooner than expected." Elise studied him. Was he warning them or threatening? Trust was always a gamble. "Thank you," she said carefully. "We'll handle it." The old man nodded and disappeared into the morning mist, leaving behind the scent of smoke and flour. The women exhaled as one. Danger was everywhere, and allies could be shadows in disguise. They sat in a tense circle, each sharing information they had gathered from scouts and sympathetic villagers. Jean had overheard soldiers speaking of a new lieutenant, ruthless and unpredictable, who would command tonight's convoy. Marguerite had mapped patrol rotations, identifying the gaps. Lisa combined the details into a plan simple yet deadly if executed perfectly. "Remember," Elise said, voice low but unwavering, "we're not just striking at them. We're showing them they cannot own this village, cannot control our lives. Each of us has a reason for being here." "Marguerite, your brother?" "Jean, your family who was taken?" "Me, my father, executed last year for defying their orders." "Tonight we make them fear what they've never feared before." Silence followed, heavy and charged. Each woman understood the stakes. They were armed with courage and determination, yes, but also the knowledge that failure meant more than death. It meant the destruction of the people they loved. The annihilation of hope itself. Marguerite's hands gripped her satchel tightly. "I'm ready," she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. Jean nodded. "So are we." No turning back? Elise looked at both of them, feeling the fierce pulse of resolve bind them together. "Then tonight we do what they cannot expect. We strike where it hurts. And we survive. If we can." Outside, the forest held its breath. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked. A distant lantern swayed, carried along a dirt road by German boots. Time was slipping away, and the danger was real. Every step, every sound, every choice could tip the balance between life and death. The women prepared themselves silently, gathering their meager supplies, checking weapons, and memorizing the convoy's path. Each glance was heavy with meaning. Words were unnecessary. They were not merely planning a raid. They were planning defiance. A midnight ambush that would mark them forever in the shadows of history. And in the quiet, as they listened to the wind rustling through the trees, each of them knew the night ahead would demand more courage, more sacrifice, and more cunning than they had ever imagined, because out there, somewhere, the enemy was already moving, and soon they would collide with a force they had never anticipated, the unyielding, unstoppable will of women determined to protect their village at any cost. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, each step a calculated gamble. The women moved like wraiths, pressing close to the undergrowth, their boots sinking softly into the damp earth. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made their hearts leap. Moonlight, pale and silver, barely touched the narrow path ahead, revealing glimpses of a world teeming with danger. Elise led the group, crouched low, her eyes sharp, scanning every movement. Marguerite followed, clutching her satchel tightly, the explosives inside a reminder of both hope and peril. Jean brought up the rear, a silent guardian, her breath measured, mind racing through contingencies. They had rehearsed the approach countless times in whispers and shadows, but now, with the convoy hours away, every misstep could be fatal. A sudden snap echoed to their left. They froze, holding their breath as a patrol emerged from the darkness, boots crunching on the forest floor. 3 men, rifles slung, lanterns swinging in the wind. Marguerite's hand went to her chest, heart hammering. "Down," Elise whispered, pressing them into the mossy earth. The patrol passed, oblivious, the lantern light bobbing past their hidden position. A collective sigh of relief escaped the women's lips once the danger had moved beyond reach, but it was a brittle, fleeting relief. They were far from safe. As they continued, the forest gave way to the edge of a river. Its surface glimmered in the moonlight, deceptively calm. The bridge they had counted on was destroyed weeks earlier, the water now a churning, icy torrent. Jean knelt by the bank, inspecting the safest crossing point. "We'll have to wade," she whispered. Her words were firm, but her lips betrayed the anxiety she felt. One by one they stepped into the cold, the water biting through their shoes, numbing their toes. The current tugged at them, threatening to sweep them away. Marguerite's satchel shifted, forcing her to fight for balance. Memories flashed behind her eyes, her brother, hiding in the village, waiting, unaware of the danger that stalked the forest. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what failure would mean. Elise's mind, however, traveled to darker memories. Her father, taken by the Nazis months ago, his lifeless eyes still haunting her dreams. That loss, that injustice, was fuel now. Every step forward, every perilous crossing, was a step toward justice or revenge. Jean's thoughts were quieter, filled with the faces of her neighbors who had been taken for questioning, some never returning. She clenched her fists as the icy current tugged at her legs. "We fight for them," she whispered to herself. The words barely audible over the rushing river. Finally, they reached the opposite bank, soaked and shivering, yet unbroken. They paused to catch their breath, eyes scanning the darkness. The path to the road narrowed, lined with trees that concealed both hope and death. The convoy would pass this way, and the women's hearts pounded in anticipation. Each sound was magnified, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of leaves in a cold wind, the slap of water against the riverbank. Every moment stretched endlessly, as though time itself conspired to make them falter. A snapping branch in the distance made Marguerite gasp, and Elise shot her a sharp look. "Control your fear," she seemed to say. They had rehearsed courage, but now it was tested in raw, living danger. The shadows themselves seemed alive, whispering warnings and threats. Marguerite tightened her grip on the satchel, feeling the weight of not just explosives, but of responsibility. Failure would mean more than death. It would mean the loss of everyone they had sworn to protect. They moved in a careful, jagged rhythm, each step deliberate. As the road came into view, they dropped to the forest floor, flattened against the earth. The narrow dirt path stretched ahead, the perfect stage for the ambush, yet treacherous in its exposure. Every sound from the distant village, the barking of dogs, the low murmur of soldiers, tugged at their nerves. Elise's whisper cut through the tension. "We're close. Steady. Breathe. Remember why we're here. Tonight they will not expect us. Tonight we will remind them that we are not invisible. That women can strike where it hurts most." Sudden gust of wind rattled the trees, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Marguerite thought she heard voices, soldiers closer than they should be. She froze, heart hammering in her chest, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. But the voices faded, leaving only the rustling leaves and the ominous silence of anticipation. Jean exhaled, shaking slightly. "Almost there," she murmured. "Almost time." The forest seemed to close around them, shadows thickening, masking them from the world, but also reminding them of the dangers lurking in every corner. They were drenched, exhausted, and terrified, but courage thrummed in their veins, stronger than fear. And then, in the distance, the faint glint of metal caught their eyes, the convoy, moving slowly along the narrow dirt road, unaware of the women lying in wait. Every nerve tightened, every muscle coiled. The ambush was near. The night had reached its crescendo. The women exchanged a glance, eyes fierce, unspoken words passing between them. This was the moment they had prepared for. Success or failure, life or death, courage or despair, it all depended on the next steps. Elise whispered one final instruction. "No hesitation, strike true, for the village, for our families, for all of us." And then, as the convoy's lights flickered closer, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Waiting for the inevitable storm to descend, the forest held its breath. The convoy crept along the narrow road, unaware that death and defiance waited in the shadows. The women pressed themselves against the earth, damp leaves clinging to their hair and clothes, eyes locked on their target. Every muscle was coiled, every nerve taut. This was the moment they had trained for, feared for, and prayed would come. Elise gave a subtle nod, a signal that sent electricity through the group. Marguerite's fingers gripped the satchel of explosives. Jean's hand hovered over her pistol. Time seemed to stretch. Even the night seemed to pause, awaiting the eruption of chaos. And then it began. Marguerite hurled the first explosive, a crude but deadly bundle, into the middle of the convoy. The truck carrying supplies erupted in a fireball, throwing plumes of smoke and shards of metal into the night. Soldiers screamed, stumbling and cursing as chaos tore through their ranks. Horses bolted, rifles clattered to the ground, and the convoy screeched to a halt, engines roaring against the silence of the forest. Elise sprang forward, pistol drawn. She fired precise, controlled shots, targeting officers and soldiers who tried to regroup. The sound of gunfire echoed off the trees, mixing with the screams of men and the roar of engines. Jean flanked the convoy, her movements fluid and lethal, picking off stragglers and creating confusion. The women moved like shadows of vengeance, each strike purposeful, each action calculated. A soldier lunged at Marguerite, rifle swinging. She stumbled, almost dropping the satchel. Fear clawed at her throat, but instinct took over. She shoved the man back with all her strength, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Another soldier turned toward her, gun raised. Her finger squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out, sharp and final. He collapsed. The forest became a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and shouts. Sparks flew as metal collided with metal. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. But amidst the chaos, tragedy struck. A younger member of their group, Claire, who had been hiding on the convoy's flank, was hit. She fell silently, the light in her eyes dimming. Marguerite screamed, running to her side, but Elise's voice cut through the panic. "Focus! We finish this, or we all die." The words were harsh, but necessary. There was no time to grieve, not yet. They pressed on, using the terrain to their advantage. Fallen logs, shadows, and the narrow bends in the road turned into traps, channels of controlled terror for the Nazis, the enemy, trained for battle. But never for women who fought with fury born of desperation and love were overwhelmed. They stumbled, fired blindly, tried to regroup, but every move was countered. Every attempt anticipated. Marguerite, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face, set another explosive. She counted silently, her heartbeat loud in her ears, before hurling it at the rear of the convoy. Another explosion ripped through the night, throwing the remaining soldiers into disarray. Jean and Elise capitalized immediately, striking with precision. Their movements synchronized like dancers in a deadly ballet, and then, in the brief pause between chaos, they saw it triumph and loss entwined. The convoy was in shambles, the Nazis scattered, some fleeing into the forest, some pinned by debris. Claire lay motionless, and Marguerite clutched her, sobbing, but the mission had succeeded. Against all odds, they had struck fear into the enemy, delivering a blow that would be whispered about in the ranks of the occupying forces. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by exhaustion and grief. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the cold night air, carrying with it the scent of fire and blood. The women staggered back into the trees, panting, their hearts still racing. Around them, silence slowly reclaimed the forest, broken only by the faint groans of the wounded and the distant retreat of the enemy. Elise lowered her weapon, voice trembling despite her attempts at calm. We did it," she whispered. "We showed them. We are not invisible. We are not weak." Marguerite held Claire close, feeling the fragility of life and the harsh weight of war. Jean wiped blood from her face, hands shaking, but her eyes glinted with grim satisfaction. "They'll think twice before underestimating us again," she said quietly. The forest seemed to exhale, the echoes of battle fading into the shadows. They had struck a decisive blow, but the cost was written on their faces, in the trembling of their hands, in the silence that followed the storm. Triumph and grief intertwined, this was the reality of war. The reality of defiance. As they retreated deeper into the forest, hearts heavy yet proud. Each knew the night would be remembered, not just for the explosions and gunfire, but for the courage, the fear, and the sacrifice of those who had refused to bow. Tonight, the women had changed the rules of engagement, and in the quiet after the chaos, the forest held the secret of their victory. But even as they disappeared into the shadows, they knew this was not the end. The enemy would recover, and the price of this victory would come due. And yet, in that moment, beneath the cold, indifferent moon, they had struck a blow that would echo far beyond the forest, proof that courage, determination, and sacrifice could shake even the most ruthless occupiers. The forest was silent, but it was a quiet heavy with weight. Smoke curled from the remnants of the destroyed convoy, twisting in the cold air like ghostly fingers. The echo of explosions and gunfire had faded, replaced by the distant sounds of the wounded, groaning, and the retreating footsteps of soldiers stumbling through the dark. Elise crouched behind a fallen log, her pistol still clutched in her trembling hands. The adrenaline that had driven her through the ambush now ebbed, leaving her raw, exhausted, and painfully aware of the losses. Claire lay nearby, bandaged hastily, groaning softly. Marguerite knelt beside her, checking her pulse repeatedly, as if reassurance could make the danger vanish. We did it," Marguerite whispered, voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She glanced around at the others. But at what cost? Jean surveyed the clearing, noting the makeshift traps they had set, the charred remains of the convoy, and the scattered soldiers. Their mission had been a success, blinding, precise, terrifying in its execution, but victory had come with a price. Claire's shoulder was grazed, Marguerite's hands were scratched and bloodied, and the psychological weight of the night pressed heavily upon them all. Elise exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. "Look at what we've done," she murmured. Her voice was steady but low, carrying both awe and exhaustion. "We struck fear into them. For once, they didn't anticipate us. We made them pay." Marguerite's eyes glistened with tears. "Yes, but the others," she said softly, her voice breaking. She thought of Claire, of the soldiers they had killed, of the unseen consequences that would ripple through the village and the occupying forces. Fear lingered like a shadow, reminding them that the night was far from over. Jean knelt by the riverbank, washing the grime and blood from her hands. "They'll come for us?" "They always do," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. This is just the beginning. We can't let our guard down." The women gathered their scattered supplies, tending to wounds as best they could. Bandages were wrapped, weapons checked, and the fragile sense of safety was maintained with taut, cautious movements. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the faint whistle of wind through the trees, kept them alert. Marguerite let out a long breath. "I can't stop thinking about the village. If the Nazis retaliate, they'll come for everyone." Elise placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We fought for them tonight. That was our choice, our stand. We'll stay hidden and we'll be ready. They may retaliate, yes, but they won't break us." A silence fell over the group, heavy but reflective. The women were exhausted, yet there was a quiet pride that shimmered beneath the grief and fear. They had done the impossible. Women, underestimated and overlooked, had disrupted a Nazi convoy, left chaos in their wake, and survived. Jean spoke again, voice steady. "The forest kept us safe tonight, but we need to move. Before dawn, before anyone else comes." She scanned the horizon, already anticipating the retaliatory patrols. "We rest here only briefly. Then we disappear." Marguerite adjusted the strap of her satchel, her fingers lingering on the remaining explosives, a bitter reminder of what had nearly gone wrong. "Do you think anyone in the village knows?" she asked. Elise shook her head. "Not yet, and they don't need to. Our work tonight is for them, for their hope, not for recognition. But the message is clear: resistance exists, and it cannot be ignored." The women began to move, careful and deliberate, slipping back into the shadows of the forest. Every sound, every movement was measured, a constant reminder that danger was still near. The taste of triumph was bittersweet. Their victory was undeniable, but so too was the knowledge that the Nazis would respond. And the cost of this fight had only just begun to reveal itself, and as the first pale fingers of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, the women disappeared deeper into the forest, carrying with them the weight of the night, the fear, the grief, the pride, and the knowledge that their fight was far from over. The shadows that had once concealed them now became allies, protecting the brave souls who dared to challenge a merciless enemy. In the quiet aftermath, one truth remained: courage had won the night, but the war, relentless and unforgiving, was still very much alive, and the forest, patient and eternal, would hold the secret of their defiance until it was time to strike again. The village was quiet when they returned, but the quiet felt unnatural, heavy with the same tension that had clung to the forest the night before. Moonlight reflected off the tiled rooftops, and the faint scent of smoke lingered from the convoy they had destroyed hours earlier. To anyone watching, the women were just ordinary villagers, daughters, neighbors, friends. But beneath the simple clothes and calm faces, the weight of their secret burned like a hidden fire. Elise moved carefully through the streets, her jacket pulled tight against the chill, hiding scratches and bruises that told the story of the night. Each step was measured, deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the villagers, some curious, some wary, but they could never know. Not yet. To reveal themselves now would be to risk everything. Marguerite trailed close behind, fingers lingering on her satchel, now emptied of explosives but still heavy with the memory of what it had carried. Her shoulder ached where she had braced against the cold river, and her legs throbbed from the hours of stealthy movement. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental weight, the fear that she could have lost her brother, the the guilt for every soldier who had fallen by her hand. Jean brought up the rear, head down, careful to avoid anyone who might recognize her. Her eyes were haunted not just by what they had done, but by what could come next. The convoy's destruction would not go unanswered. The Nazis would retaliate, perhaps with brutality the village had never seen. And yet, even in this fear, there was a strange kind of pride, a realization that their courage had made a difference, that ordinary women had struck a blow that would echo far beyond their small community. They gathered in the small attic of an abandoned house on the village's edge, a temporary sanctuary. Dust motes floated in the moonlight, and the silence was almost deafening. No words were spoken at first. They simply removed their jackets, checked each other for injuries, and let the night's adrenaline ebb into exhaustion. Marguerite finally spoke, voice soft, almost a whisper. "Do you ever think about the ones we left behind? Those we couldn't save?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, the bravest of warriors seemed like a frightened girl again. Elise placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We do what we can," she said gently. "We honor them by surviving, by continuing the fight, and we trust each other to carry that weight together." Jean nodded, kneeling beside Claire, who still winced at the memory of the ambush. "We're stronger because we share this. Alone it would crush us, but together we can bear it. Every fear, every scar, every loss, we can face it because we're not alone." The women sat in silence, letting the weight of the night settle around them. Shadows flickered across the walls, mirroring the shadows in their minds. Memories of gunfire, explosions, screams, and blood intermingled with small flashes of laughter and whispered encouragement from the night. They held these fragments close, fragile and dangerous, knowing that they would be carried for the rest of their lives. Marguerite finally laughed softly, a brittle sound, shaking her head. "We're insane, aren't we? Ordinary women, hiding in the woods, blowing up convoys. And somehow we survived." Elise allowed herself a small smile, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Perhaps. But the world needs us to be a little insane. The world needs those who refuse to bend, who refuse to let fear rule them." Jean looked at both of them, eyes shadowed but fierce. "We may be ordinary in appearance, but we've done extraordinary things. And tonight we proved it to ourselves." In the quiet of the attic, their bonds solidified. They were no longer just villagers, no longer just women trying to survive. They were sisters in arms, bound by courage, trauma, and shared purpose. And as the first light of dawn began to pierce the small attic window, they knew that even though the night's victory was behind them, the war and the choices they would continue to make lay ahead. Every scar, every secret, every fear would be carried in silence, hidden from those around them, yet woven into the unbreakable fabric of their courage. And in that fragile, fleeting peace, the women rested not as heroes, not as warriors, but as human beings, each bearing the weight of a secret the world could never fully understand. The first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, painting the village in soft gold and pale pink. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air, a silent reminder of the chaos that had swept through the night. From a distant ridge, the women watched, shadows among the trees, their faces tired but resolute. The village lay below them, peaceful for now, unaware of the full scale of the ambush, yet subtly shifted. An unspoken tremor of hope had begun to ripple through the streets. Voices drifted faintly from the cobblestone alleys. Windows opened and neighbors whispered in cautious excitement. News of the convoy's destruction had reached them quickly, carried by those brave enough to tell the story in hushed tones. The women observed from the safety of the forest, letting the villagers celebrate silently. Their hearts swelled with pride, but relief was tempered with caution. The fight was far from over. Marguerite leaned against a tree, watching a group of children run through the morning mist, unaware of the war pressing in on all sides. Her fingers brushed the empty satchel, now a symbol of both fear and victory. "We did something. Good," she whispered. "Something that matters." Jean's eyes scanned the village below, noting both the tentative smiles and the wary glances. Yes, she said softly, but they don't know the cost yet. The Nazis will respond. They always do. We have to stay ready. Elise placed a hand on each of their shoulders, grounding them in the moment. We've changed something tonight. Not the war, not yet, but this village, these people, their hope. That's ours to protect. For now, we wait, we watch, and we survive. The forest around them was still, as if holding its breath in solidarity. Birds began their cautious songs, and the wind carried a quiet reassurance. The women allowed themselves a small moment of solace, feeling the weight of their courage and the certainty that, despite the fear and exhaustion, they had made a mark the enemy would not soon forget. Marguerite glanced back toward the shadowed trees, where they had emerged from the night before. "Do you think it will be enough?" she asked, voice trembling. Elise's eyes, dark and unwavering, swept over the village and then the horizon. "It's never enough," she said. "But it is a start. And sometimes a start is all that's needed to ignite something larger." The women fell silent, letting the early morning embrace them. Their victory was quiet, their defiance unseen by many, yet potent. Each knew the danger was far from over. The enemy would regroup, patrols would intensify, and retaliation was inevitable. But in this fragile dawn, they had given their people hope, and in doing so, had lit a spark that could not be extinguished. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the village and the forest beyond. The women disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the whisper of defiance carried on the morning breeze. Their fight would continue, hidden in the shadows, relentless and unyielding. But for this moment, at least, the village could breathe. And that was enough.